Welcome, everyone. My name is Cliff Trafser. I'm a professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. And this lecture is sponsored by UCR Palm Desert, as well as the Rupert Costo Endowment. Rupert Costo was a Cahuilla man, and he was a mountain Cahuilla from the Anza area. And he helped, with a group of people, start the University of California, Riverside. He was one of the members who pushed for UC to create the campus in Riverside. And he and his wife lived in San Francisco. He worked for Caltrans for a number of years. And in the 1930s, they bought a very nice house in San Francisco. And because they had no children, when they passed away, they gave their endowment, they gave their estate to the University of California, Riverside. For one thing, they endowed the chair that I now hold. It is a chair that several people have held over the years since 1984. And the chair is about working with Native American community members and working with your research, and sharing that research widely, not just with scholars, but with the general public as well. And it's through the endowment that we're able to host Don Fixico today. And I wanted to welcome you and say how special it is for me to have Don and Michelle here, for them to take the time to come from Arizona State University, come on over here and join us, and to share this wonderful talk that we're going to hear about American Indian identity. But before we do, I want to acknowledge that we're on Cahuilla land here. This is desert Cahuilla land. It is the land of the Agua Caliente people. And I asked one of my former students, Dr. Milanovic, if he would come and share an invocation with all of you in recognition of this place being Cahuilla country. Sean, if we could begin with this invocation.
Miyahwe emem nenetu Sean Milanovic nehensekina Agua Caliente. I want to welcome you to God's country. It is so beautiful in this place, is it not? The Coachella Valley, the beautiful sands, the Verbena, the brittle bush, and all the canyons, the springs are just gushing with water right now. Creator has really blessed every one of us to be able to participate and enjoy his creations. But I want to open up with one of our bird songs. And the Cahuilla bird songs are about the migrations of our people, our travels through this land. Long time ago. But so you always wonder what song you're gonna sing. Will this one work? Yeah. Okay. Woo-hoo! Don, I'm very grateful that you're here today to come and be with us, to share your story, your knowledge with us. So from the bottom of my heart, Alawa. Quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo. Quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo. Quinya mehele, quinya yo homo. Quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo. homo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, paha tiska tumio umo, wema, hayo tumio umo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, paha tiska tumio umo, wema, hayo tumio umo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mele, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mehele, quinya yo homo, quinya mele, quinya me. Achuma. I just wanted to thank all the ancestors that came before me, you know, that fought and struggled so that we could be here today to share our stories, to present our views in our history from our own mouths. I think that that's real important. So to have Don speaking tonight, to have, you know, the vast number of indigenous people that have spoken here, just here at this place alone, here in the Coachella Valley, at UCR, and all along the natives in our native scholars are growing in number, speaking on behalf of their tribal communities, putting out their voices that have for so long have not been heard. So, you know, we're really honored to be here tonight. Aho.
Thank you, Sean. If you would, please, if you have a cell phone, if you would shut it off before we get started, I'd be much obliged. I want to acknowledge Tamara Hedges and her good staff who helped put this on. They are not just Tamara, but her staff does a wonderful job and an unsung job in making these events available to the public. And so I want to shout out to you and thank you. Thank you. Yeah. In 1978 or 1980, I think it was, when I was at Washington State University, I had an idea to pull together American Indian historians from all over the United States, perhaps Canada, to come together to talk about how, at that time, we were going to reinterpret history, and that we were going to use new sources, meaning the knowledge that can be gained from intellectuals on reservations and within Native communities in urban areas. And so a number of people came to Spokane, and we had quite a day. And one of the people I met for the first time was Donald Fixico. Now, Don is Shawnee, Sac, Fox, Muskogee, and Seminole. And as we were having lunch and Dave Edmonds gave a little talk about some of his research, Don stood up and said, you know, I don't know that we all understand the importance of what we are doing, 1980, some years ago, and that we are the folks now who are going to be the professors who will train students, who will work with communities, and we are going to change the interpretations that have been presented in the past But it'll be based not only on archival research, but on community-based knowledge and understanding. And I was so impressed with Don saying that, because I thought, he is right. That's why we're doing this. And that's what Don has done since those days, since 1980 up in Spokane. He has spent his life doing a number of things at different universities. He's now at Arizona State University. He's been there some years now. He's a Regents Professor, a Distinguished Foundation Professor at ASU. His specialty is Native American history, but he was also trained in the American West, because when Don and I did our PhDs in Oklahoma, he went to that other school. I went to Oklahoma State University. He went to the University of Oklahoma. But we studied Native Americans through the American West. So we were trained first and foremost in the history of the American West, and then a subfield of Native American history. And also he has done some public history and oral history in his life. Don has written 25 books and probably more than that. That's what I found on the internet. But I've got some of the titles for you. American Indians in a Modern World, Treaties with American Indians, Daily Life of Native Americans in the 20th Century, The American Indian Mind in a Linear World, one of my favorites, The Urban Indian Experience in America, The Invasion of Indian Country in the 20th Century, which is still going on, and Termination, Relocation, Federal Indian Policy, 1945-1960. This was his first book, and it's still considered a seminal work in our field. Don is an unusual individual because, unlike a lot of professors who have no community, so if you're a medievalist, you don't have a community really. Maybe over there you have a community. And even 20th century historians of the United States, they don't really have communities. But Don has understood from the get-go that he has a community, not just his own Native community in Oklahoma, but the Native communities of wherever he has lived, to have a relationship with people and to learn from them, because he knows that he is living in their place. With that, I want to introduce a top-notch scholar and my friend, Donald Fixico.
I want to thank Tamara and her staff and everything, and Allison Palmer and Cliff, my friend. We've known each other since way back then in 1980, and so it's just incredible. And one of the things that I've learned over the years, if you're in academia, is that friendships, you make a lot of friends with the internet and all of that, and it goes on, but you begin to make friends around the world. And if you can, it's maintaining those friendships over time. And that's what really kind of makes you feel lucky. I feel very fortunate because we have a tribe. We have a tribe of scholars, and what we help each other, and we help young people coming up to be a part of that, because that's what we're in the business for, to be a people professor. And that's what we should do, and to bring about a better understanding of Native people. I am glad that Cliff acknowledged whose land we are on, and so for this presentation. My wife, Michelle Martin, is in the front row here. I'm very proud of Michelle because she finished her doctorate in history in the last spring. And so not only that, but she got a job. She got a job at Northeastern State University in Oklahoma, fortunately my home state, and so I'll be retiring in about 3 years, and so we'll be commuting for a bit, but we've done that before when she was in grad school at New Mexico, taking coursework. We commuted, with my being at Arizona State, but I'm so proud of her, especially when jobs are so few in academia right now. So anyway, 1, 2, 3. There's 3 things I want to mention. I think I've covered 2 of them. The other is that this presentation, From the Inside, From Outside, American Indian Identity. I've always wanted to write a book on American Indian identity, and actually I did finish that manuscript about 8 years ago, then I tore it up. Because I just didn't get it right. I felt like it's got to be there, and it's got to be about human people, individuals, and what they feel being Native and being American Indian or Native American, as some people call us. And then I couldn't quite get the title right, and I said in an email to Cliff, I said, I want to talk about how people from the outside, how that they say who we are, and I also want to talk about from the inside what it's like to be talked about, and how that you feel being Native, even if you're part or you're full blood or something like that. How does that feel? And so, because if you feel and just talk about being on the inside, what it feels like, that's only half of the story. And you may think that, well, it's a full story, and it is in itself. And so Cliff is the one that came up with the presentation title, so I'll blame it on him. So, but thank you for coming out this evening. I mean, you could be at home right now watching Jeopardy, or how to refurbish your house. That's what we do in the evenings over dinners. To all of these television shows about how to fix up your house and do that. So we are big fans of that. So this. A little bit about myself that Cliff filled in so much. I was born in Oklahoma and raised in Oklahoma. Thought I'd never leave Oklahoma. And so now it's kind of hard to get back, but Michelle has gotten us back. So my home state, her home state is Michigan. So I hear maize and blue all the time. But fortunately for me, she loves Kansas, she loves Oklahoma. And so it'll be like going home. It seems like it was like over a dozen years ago. Wilma Mankiller was giving a presentation at ASU, and I went up and afterwards and shook hands with her and told her, who I was and everything. And so, and she looked at me and she said, "When are you coming home? When are you coming home?" And so it's people like Wilma Mankiller. There's a woman who became, the leader of her people, the Cherokees in Oklahoma, and who fought through so much that women of color in particular, they fight through a double glass ceiling. First one is being a person of color, but then being a female, you have to kind of crash through the second glass ceiling too, to kind of let the rest of the world know, what you've done and what you can do and what you're capable of doing, and get out of the way. But no, it's something that we don't recognize enough, is the strength of our women. In Native society, it's Native women who are very strong, and I could talk about my grandmother. She was about this tall, but she said family is important. Work hard. Didn't matter if you're a janitor or what, but to work hard and to respect was another thing, and clean. I remember on my grandfather's allotment, we had running water. That is, if you ran out and pumped the water and ran back in with it, and that was our running water. But she had a number 2 tub that I remember growing up with my cousins, that she cleaned us. I mean, she scrubbed us, and we were brown. We weren't red. We were pink, because all the scrubbing she did, I mean, she made sure that you were clean. And she ironed everything. She didn't have she had a wooden cook stove, and she had 2 irons on it. And she ironed everything. I had blue jeans, of course. We were poor. I had patches on my jeans, and if you know anything about Oklahoma, it's the red earth, and so the red dirt would stain my blue jeans. But I had creases in my jeans, and she ironed pillowcases, sheets, everything. If you stood still, you were going to get ironed. So that was my grandmother. So much of this is kind of coming, about her. I also want to say that this is really kind of a presentation on Indian identity. It's not like the presentation on Indian identity, because everybody who's Native has a story of their own. And I want you to be aware of that, because I'm not speaking for all Native people. I'm just speaking for, what I've known and what I've come across kind of in the past. I have actually met Rupert Costo a long time ago and Jeanette Henry, and they were really a dynamic couple, because in the Bay Area in San Francisco, then I would read these monthly newspapers that would come out, Wasaha, and all of this kind of activity. I thought, I've got to go out there and see that. And so when I was out researching in the area, then I got to meet them. And so they're a dynamic couple, as they were. and a couple of times after that too. So if you met Rupert Costo, and especially if you met Jeanette Henry, you met a fireball of a Cherokee. She was just that way. So as I said, I'm Shawnee, absentee Shawnee, a quarter Sac and Fox. I'm enrolled, Muskogee, a quarter of that, and Seminole. So I was really kind of raised as Muskogee and Seminole because they kind of believe the same worldview and so forth. And I was born in Shawnee. I like to say that my claim to fame is that I was born in Shawnee, and so was Brad Pitt. Now, I don't share that information, it's privileged information, because I tell it to my undergraduates, and they say, "Who's Brad Pitt?" So you have to kind of read your audience and think, well, they probably know who Brad Pitt is. So anyway, so let's get started here. Some basic facts. So as you can read, about 5.2 million Native people, maybe plus 2 or 3 or 4 now, more, today is a part of American population overall of about 332 million. And we're just about 2% of that huge amount. And a lot of people not realizing that 2/3 of Native people live in urban areas, in the cities, all due to relocation in the 1950s and 1960s. And there are about 326 reservations, including within that number, 59 rancherias. About almost, and I didn't dare put a number because it seems to change almost monthly or sometimes every 3 or 4 months, nearly 600 federally recognized tribes. And so when you compare that and you try to teach Native history, in my comparison, there's only 193 countries in the world. So when you look at Native history, it's so many groups and so much, and you multiply that by 2 because men and women, having their own versions of history, and so it's quite a challenge. I've looked and kind of counted, but there's something like 14 kinds of Indian identity I want to share with you a little bit later, and at least 34 stereotypes that are really kind of negative according to the historical relations of Native people with non-Native people, the Indian Wars. Over 1,500 wars and battles and attacks and skirmishes authorized by the federal government against Native people. About 6 stereotypes are positive. The brave Indian, the warrior, etc. And about another 6 are kind of neutral. So I've counted them all, just kind of, in my curiosity. So I want to begin with this photo, 2 photos side by side, and you probably are familiar with that perhaps. This is Tom Torlino, in which he attended Carlisle Indian School. Carlisle Indian School was started by Richard Pratt in 1879. It was like the example of Indian boarding schools. And so this picture on the left, where he looks more traditional, was taken by a photographer by the name of John Choate. And John Choate had a photography shop store in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so he took this kind of before shot, and it's really about 4 years later, not 3 as I have, but in 1886. And this is the after shot of who he was. Now, what Richard Pratt talked about was assimilation. And so in his efforts to assimilate Native people came from boys and girls, came from reservations, rural areas, kind of looking like the one on the left, that kind of image. And what they were to become was in this kind of transition of becoming something new. And it was Pratt's famous statement about killing the Indian and saving the man in the children. So when you look at these identities and full bloods and mixed bloods and card-carrying Indians, and I want to read to you a page. This is from a novel by the title of There by Tommy Orange. It's kind of out right now, and it's really about the post-relocation period in the Bay Area of Oakland, and it's really kind of heart-wrenching, and so it's really kind of challenging. But as you look at this list, he actually kind of provides a list, and I thought, well, his list is better than my list. So let me read, if I can, part of it to you. And he states that we are Indians and Native Americans, and American Indians and Native American Indians, North American Indian, Natives, Indians, and Indians, status Indians and non-status Indians, and First Nation Indians, and Indians. So Indians, we either think about the fact of every single day, or we never think about it at all. We're all urban Indians, indigenous Indians, res Indians, and Indians from Mexico, Indians from Central and South America. And so we are Alaska Native Indians and Native Hawaiians and European expatriate Indians and Indians from several tribes, recognized Indians. We are enrolled members of tribes and disenrolled members, and we are full-bloods and half-bloods and quarter-bloods and eighths and sixteenths and 32nds and unmath achievable Indians. So he talks about all kinds of Indians in terms of Indian identity. So it's a very long topic. Now, let's look at from the outside first. So from the outside, I want to talk about three important points, but the first one involves publications and books written about. There are over 30,000 books written about Native people, over 30,000 books written about Native people, and that's no figure. So I suspect about maybe 40,000, maybe 50,000 now. And so we're now looking for books written by Native people about Native people. And so we're now kind of into that scholarship. In 1978, Robert Burkhoff Jr. wrote this book, The White Man's Indian. And his table of contents I have in 4 parts. The first one is the idea of Indian. Part 2, and of course there's kind of smaller chapters in between, and part 2 is the scientific image of Indian. And part 3, as stated, is the imaginary of Indian in literature, writing about Native people. And part 4 is imagery and federal policy or white policy about Native people. So that book had a very much of an impact because it is really kind of what Native people are supposed to be. So if you're kind of growing up, you're young, well, who am I supposed to be? Then according to Burkhoffer's book, then you're kind of in that category, or this is what you're kind of led to believe. So that book has had a very kind of jarring effect on Native people, whether we realize it or not, but we're kind of within that book, within that realm. Probably the most well-known book is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, written by Dee Brown. His first name is actually Doris, and so if you were a guy, I think you probably want to be called Dee. And so Dee Brown, in writing this book, coming out in 1970, it has sold over 5 million copies and published in 17 different languages. I wish I'd written that book. Even Vine Deloria Jr. has said, I wish I'd read that book. I mean, so it's probably the most well-known book on Native people, as I said. It's had that kind of impact in bringing about the Indian voice. So the first point is the power of print capitalism, in the power of publications, because what you read, then you read it, and if you're a Native person, you begin to believe it yourself, that that's the way that you're supposed to be and to become. So it has that kind of impact, the power of the press, the power of books. Now, the author, Anne Stevens, you may not be familiar with her, but you're going to be the next couple of seconds. She was born in Connecticut in 1810, and she was an editor and a writer of 25 novels. Now, look at that, born in 1810. 25 novels. So she was quite a productive individual. And so it's her book. It's a Native woman married to the white hunter by the name of Maleska. And so this book, when it came out in 1860, it's a very important book because it was the first dime novel. Only cost 10 cents. And so it sold thousands of copies when it came out. And when you look at dime novel history, because they're even on Kit Carson, and Dr. Travis has written on Kit Carson, but he will also tell you that Kit Carson didn't know how to read. But there was a book that came about him, a dime novel, and so he looked at the pictures. But over 40,000 titles, different titles of dime novels. Dime novels for people, if you were working in Chicago in a meatpacking plant, a company, or maybe farming, and you knew how to read, well, you would kind of dig out your dime novel and read a few pages, maybe at lunch. Why? It would allow you to escape somewhere, maybe out to the west. maybe somewhere to Alaska, gold mining. It would take you away. So now that we have, flat screens and all of that, then this was kind of an instant escape that you could go for a little bit, because working 10 hours a day, something like that for literally peanuts for a wage, it was a time of oppression. But if you could read, it was an outlet. But what that outlet we don't really realize is it changes the course of thought. Probably the most important category in books that I talk about, and you might want to write this down if you're a student taking notes or something. What scholars, what we aim for is a pivotal book, a pivotal book that changes the course of thought and starts a new school of thinking, or it has that kind of effect. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Robert Burkoffer Jr.'s book, The White Man's Indian, pivotal book. Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, pivotal book. So this particular book, let me just give you the plot real quickly, is a tragedy of a Mohawk woman. So she marries this white hunter who's always in the forest and everything, and she meets him, and they marry. They have a child. And so it's the child that they have as a boy, and as the boy grows up, that it's in the course of the Hudson Valley that the colonists are fighting at war with the Mohawk people, and so we have Indian-white conflict, war going on. And so she talks about this. And so a child of Indian and white blood is born out of this kind of conflict. And the child is taken away after her father, the leader of the Mohawks in this fictional story, then kills her husband in battle. And so he's fatherless. And so the child is taken away and raised by not the grandparents, but the grandmother. And finally, the grandfather comes around. And so what Mollusca does is she finds employment as a housekeeper and cook to this family, the grandparents. And so the grandfather finally comes around, loves the boy and everything, and says to Mollusca, you can only come and work for us if you are never divulge the truth that this young boy, our grandson, is your son. So she never says anything about that until he's older and everything. And so she's old in age herself now, and she returns to her home. He has to be traveling, hunting in the woods. And so they connect. And so she tells the young man, you are my son. And he, in all of this kind of involvement of war against Indians and whites, going to war, he can't believe that he's part Indian. And he throws himself over a cliff and dies. He dies, she races down and is crying, and she puts her body over his because he's dying right there on the spot. And she dies of a broken heart. Very powerful story. I practiced that 3 or 4 times. No, but getting back to the story, see the impact of that story of teaching who is the enemy, who is to be killed. And this book sells thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. That's the power of the press. So that's point 1. Point 2, going back to Richard Pratt, starting in Carlisle in 1879. He's the first person actually in the US to use the term racism. And this is in 1902 at a conference at the Lake Mohonk, not Lake Mohawk, but Lake Mohonk in New York. It's an upscale hotel still there, very historic, quite posh, in the Catskills Mountains in New York. And so he's talking about the assimilation. He's talking about Carlisle Boarding School, his own school that he started. He's a former captain, and he kind of rises through the ranks, and he asked the military, for barracks to start Carlisle Indian School, and so that's given to him after he continually ask and ask and ask and ask. I guess if you continue to ask something for something that it might be granted. I got to tell you about my neighbor as I'm thinking about him right now. My neighbor from Idaho, I see him almost every day when I go jogging in the morning. It's when I'm coming home, that's when he wants to stop and talk. And he's a salesperson, so I put my hands in my pockets to make sure I have all my money left. And so he says that no only means yes later on. no only means yes later on. He asked his wife to marry him 6 times. That's my friend Thad. And so Richard Pratt and Gotti Carlisle, the barracks, to get started, then talk about assimilation and education and Tom Torlino, et cetera. And he said this in the speech in 1902, association of races and classes is necessary in order to destroy racism and classism. That's when the term is first used in the United States. And so it's pro-assimilation that he's talking in favor, that the end of the trail has come to Native people and they need to be prepared for citizenship and so forth. And so this is Richard Pratt's teaching, the power of school. I look at this picture right here, Carlisle Indian School, and I as I was going through these slides about a dozen times before lunch this morning, and going through them again, then I was thinking about myself when I was in first grade. And so I sat in a country school outside of Shawnee where I was raised, and so sitting on the back row. And so I was a silent young Indian kid, not saying very much. And I remember the first day of school because I had my Big Chief tablet, and so you may remember that. And my parents bought me these pencils, were like logs, and you couldn't possibly break them. And I looked at the other kids, and they had all kind of pencils. And boy, if you had an Eversharp, you were uptown. And Eversharp, if you could screw in, the lead would come out and all of that. And if you had one of those, wow. So it was me and that Big Chief tablet. And I didn't realize this until years later that I always sat on the back row in school, being a child of color, a student of color, and I sat on the back row. It was okay. I knew all the answers because I had a curious mind. I would always read ahead because I was curious, I wonder what's going to happen next. So I would read ahead, whether it be math, geography, history, or whatever. And so if anyone didn't know the answer, and it finally came to my 3rd grade teacher, Miss Coker, she said, finally, Donald, do you know the answer? And I gave her the answer to whatever it was. And so she began to realize that anytime she needed the answer and the class didn't know the answer, she would look at me and then, Donald, do you know the answer to this? Well, it's this. And so I got the nickname, Mr. Know-It-All. And so you'd be surprised how popular you can become if you know all the answers. But see, it was coming from a different culture and different background. And honest to God, this is not my right hand, so I can raise my left hand. I don't know how Alice in Wonderland goes. I've never read the book. I know something happens, but coming from a different culture, you don't read those things. So reading American history was like me reading about a foreign country, learning different things, and that was my curious mind that I kept learning, kind of wanting to know, because what kids were talking about in school, we don't do that at home. We go to stomp dances, we go to ceremonial dances, and this is what we do, and all of that. So it was really kind of learning about a different kind of way of life and a way of thinking. So it was quite an education to me, being in school. So this impact of schools, and Richard Pratt, about 357 total Indian schools across the nation. And so it was an enormous movement of education, but education for civilization, preparation for citizenship, as we all know, but also affecting the identity of Native people, Native kids. Kids like myself, I suppose, at the time, but you learn how to think, too against Native people, that Native people are meant to be bad. And so that's what was going on. Third important point is mascots. This is the impact of media, social media. And so it creates this kind of, this visual rhetoric of what you're supposed to be or supposed to look like, and people not realizing, well, Chief Wahoo, wow. Every time I see that picture, that image, I cringe. And if you're a Native person, you feel that, then you feel that kind of cringe too. And so that's what all of this is about, and especially this evening. So that is from the outside. And just to kind of maybe just summarize a little bit more, that it's the power of the media in these relationships of the past. It's the power of publications, the books, the textbooks, all of that. And it's really kind of a way of teaching people how to think and what to think. And really, it's not all positive. So it's that kind of negativism that Native people have had to overcome in the process. So we can talk more about from the outside, but I want to also talk to you about being Indian from the inside. So when we talk about from the inside, and I want to go here, so the individual on your left, and maybe you recognize him, is Charles Alexander Eastman, also known as Ohaisa. How many people have never seen him or never heard of him? Okay, okay. Incredible individual. He earned a medical degree in 1890. In 1890 was also the Wounded Knee Massacre. So when he was going to college in med school, it was a very difficult time for him to be there, much less graduate. So he started at a boarding school. He actually was about 4 years old in 1862 during the Minnesota War of that year, 1862. And he remembers that his grandmother whisking him away, and so he's just a little guy, and so his grandmother's got him by the hand and says, "We've got to get out of here," because the militia of Minnesota were sent after the Dakota people, his people, and he was just a kid. Taken west, they were kind of going to find protection with Sitting Bull, and then they realized they were not going to get it, so they went into Canada. And so it's from Canada that his father, who he thought had been killed in the Dakota War of 1862, I don't know if you know the story, it's where that 38 were hung, the Dakota people, the largest mass execution in American history, all at once, 38. And he thought that his father was killed, but his father returns to him and his grandmother because he wants to take his son away with him to be educated. And so his dad had learned how to speak English, knew some of the alphabet, A, B, and C. And so he wanted Ohaisa, who becomes Charles Eastman, who becomes Dr. Eastman, to go to school. And he does. I just want to dwell for a moment. He goes to a frontier school, rides his pony, races a couple of other kids. The two other kids go inside the school. And he's kind of sitting there on his pony, gets off his pony, and he walks up to the school door, and the bell has already rung, and he reaches for the doorknob, the door handle. Can you imagine that moment? He could have easily gotten back on his pony and ridden away. But he turns the door handle and opens it. And in crossing that threshold, it changes his life. In the early 1900s, up to about 1912, he wrote about 9 books. Boy, if you've ever written a book, your first book, you think this is going to be the last one. It's going to be the only one if it ever gets published. But he goes on to write 9 books. And so I want to kind of quote from one of his books, this is from the inside, being a full blood. Now, let me just kind of add a caveat. It's really kind of idealistic, or the virtues of being an Indian. And this is what he said: "And to harmonize myself with nature. To this end, I was made to build a body both symmetrical and enduring, a house for the soul to live in, a sturdy house defying the elements. I must have faith and patience, and I must learn self-control and be able to maintain silence. I must do with as little as possible and start with nothing most of the time, because a true Indian always shares whatever he may possess." Those are the standards of the Dakota people that he was brought up with. That when everything else is going crazy, that to walk this road, to walk this path, this was, yes, it's idealistic, but it's a philosophy, but it's like a roadmap given to him and what he learned. And that was what is coming kind of a full-blood perspective. If you have any comment, even now, I'd appreciate it, about what it might be like to be a full-blood. See, because anywhere he goes, then he's going to be Indian. Especially in 1890, during that time, and he becomes a medical doctor. You can imagine how many patients he had. And so he goes off into politics, and he becomes a part of the Society of American Indians, of professional people who are teachers and churchmen and lawyers and others like him, like Carlos Montezuma. They're part of the small clique, this new tribe of Indian professionals. And where did they form originally? 1912, Columbus, Ohio. So that's the irony. But they go on from there. And one of the things they heavily criticized is the Bureau of Indian Affairs being too paternalistic, that there needs to be more sense of choice and freedom for Native people to do what they decide to do. It's an uphill battle. So no comments about being full blood. Okay, well, let me tell you the full blood. Full blood, and I know that some of you have heard of passing, right? If you look light enough, then sometimes you're identified not as Native, you're something else. But if you look Native, like I do myself, then you are a person of color. There's no denying it. I was telling my dad one time when I was in the 8th grade, I said, Dad, I'm the only Indian, pretty much me and my brother, 2.5 years younger, in the school. And we had a cousin, we found out that, so the three of us kind of hung out a little bit. And so that was good. But when you're the only one in the entire group, in the entire class, I said, Dad, I stand out. And so I was kind of tearful about it. And he said, son, I know that you stand out because you're Indian. So why not be outstanding? So I took that to heart to maybe try to do something with what I could do and trying to figure out what that was, because I'm the first one in my family to go to college. I'm also the first one to graduate from high school. My dad went as far as the 4th grade. My mother went as far as the 8th grade. And so it was learning by making those mistakes when you're the first one, you're a pioneer. That's it. When I say that, it's kind of ironic that I'm calling myself a pioneer. But to go out and navigate those waters that nobody else has gone before. But you find other people like Cliff Travisor, other individuals fighting the same fight, fighting the same struggle. And it's not just a Native struggle. It's for all people. If you're from a foreign country coming to America, the story of immigrants, we fight the same struggle. You fight the same struggle if you're a poor boy from Appalachia, the same struggle. This is the hard one. Even a rich boy from New York City or something like that, fighting to be, to be accepted. And we just want to be accepted. And so my dad said, why not be outstanding? So that was encouraging to me. The person on the right, young lady, is Mary Crow Dog. And Mary Crow Dog is from Rosebud Reservation, and she's Rosebud, Lakota. And so there was a book written about her called Lakota Woman, and it's really her autobiography. During the early 1970s is when she was a part of the American Indian movement. And so that book gained a lot of attention. And so, but she talks about being a mixed blood, and so from the inside, these are her words, and she says, I am Aiska, a breed. That's what the white kids used to call me. And when I grew bigger, they stopped calling me that because it would get them a bloody nose. I have white blood in me, and often I wish to be able to purge it out of me. And as a young girl, I used to look at myself in the mirror, trying to find a clue as to who and what I was. My face is very Indian, and so are my eyes and my hair. My skin is very light. Always, I waited for the summer, for the prairie sun, the Badlands sun, to tan me and make me into a real skin. So her wanting to be more Indian than what she looked like. But that's not a quick fix, even if she could wave a magic wand, because it's a trauma that she carried around inside her, being a mixed blood. And believe it or not, but Native people, we can be racist too. We can be racist against other Native people. And racism, I think it covers a lot of bases, because there's also some tribes who prefer to be their own tribe rather than to be another tribe. I used to have a top 10 list of the tribes most difficult to get along with. And one of my tribes from the Seminoles were on that list. They're just hard to get along with. I don't think there's anybody from Oklahoma who's Kiowa, but I put them on that list too. So Kiowas are kind of on that hit list or whatever that list, just people who are so proud of who they are that they want you to know. And I won't say Kiowa, I'll use Seminole instead because I'm part Seminole. Oh, you're not Seminole. Well, oh, you wish you were Seminole? And they just kind of go on and on and on. And you think, just get over it. And so we have that kind of competition, even among tribes and everything like that. And so that kind of goes on. And so maybe our own greatest enemy is ourselves. But it's because of the great diversity. And as I said a little bit earlier, nearly 600 federally recognized tribes and only 193 countries in the entire world. So that is indeed a great diversity and great complexity going on. And so she talks about this, about this non-acceptance by the full-bloods, that she wants to be more. And, but she shows enough Indians, so she's kind of in that caught in between. I want to share some Muskogee philosophy with you, if you allow me to. I want to teach you a word that I grew up with, and I think it explains a lot. And the word is pronounced as Ehose. And Ehose is E-H-O-S-A. Ehose. And what that means is that when you are caught in something and you're not for sure, and whatever it is, this something, let me start this over again. You ever go to the refrigerator maybe at night and you open the door, and you think, what am I looking for? Has that ever happened to you? You go into a room and you flip on the light, what did I come in here for? So you're not sure. Believe me, that happens more increasingly with age. But that's a very simplified form of Ehosa, that you get caught in a situation where that you're not for sure how to get out of. Very quick story. Let me check the time here. Okay. Well, we got to end this really quick. Okay, I won't tell you the story, I'll tell you afterwards. But to simply, Ehosa is being caught in between. And if you let that happen, you will become panic driven. You will not know what time of day it is. You can't even move except you're breathing. You are in that kind of petrified fear of confusion. And that confusion can last 20 seconds. It can last 2 years. It can last 2 hours if you allow yourself to be caught in Ehosa. And see what Mary Crow Dog was, she was caught in Ehosa. She was caught in between. And many of us are caught in between and we don't realize that. But realizing that it is Ehosa and that you can get through that, you will live by moving straight forward and going on to the next project, and you can overcome Ehosa. But many of us never learn to get out of Ehosa, and the greatest tragedy is self-destruction. This one here, from the inside, invisible, mixed blood. I don't have an image, but it's like Indians don't exist, like we're nothing, or we're just, just a drunken Indian stereotype. You can be walking down the street and see an Indian dressed in a suit and never see him. He's not there. That's the invisible Indian. He's invisible. But right behind him comes one that's all wind up and that's staggering and makes a heck of a spectacle. And they stereotype him, there's the Indian. See, it's been what we've been taught to think, rather than to help the drunken person, to help them to get on their feet, but to think the worst of them. And that's the impact, the power of the stereotypes over time, historical stereotypes. And the other point here being passing. And this is about the last of my slides here. And so this is from the inside, the pretendian. And so in my community, there's a lot of blonde hair and blue eyes. There's one woman in particular, she's totally fair. If she was away from the community, you'd think she was white, but then her accent is exactly like mine. And because she speaks Cree all the time, I don't even think twice that she's native, even though she's blonde and has blue eyes. You don't have to look Indian to be Indian. Some Indians who are non-Indians are better Indians than Indians. What did I say? I'm not going to say it again. I don't think Dan can say it again. For example, like Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone wanted to become Shawnee and to become Indian, and so he walked like the Shawnee people did. He hunted like them. And first of all, when they caught him, they escorted him outside of the Shawnee country and kicked him out. But he would come back. And so he got better and better at his tracking, at the way he walked and everything, and the way he hunted and all of that. And so in a way, he became a better Shawnee than many of the Shawnees. And I say it about my own tribe. And here, final thoughts. Final thoughts involving, I know I've just thrown a pebble across the pond and everything, but trauma is involved. In fact, one of our historians that I can't think of the name of says that probably everybody in this country is born as some kind of trauma at some point. And we should look for trauma in our histories because we've probably experienced trauma. Discrimination and prejudice, those are self-evident, and racism. But this coming from the outside affects the confidence of Native people. When you have been othered and told, by Robert Burkhofer and other books and television shows, that this is what you're supposed to be, you're not as good. And you have that feeling of not being wanted. And so you feel like the second-class citizens. Then on the other hand, there are people who want to prove they're Indian just for the benefits. And you kind of think, oh, where have they been? When the time's rough being an Indian, then that's the challenge, is to stay in the fight. Let me end with this really quick story here. Leonard Bruyere, he's gone now, earned a PhD from that other school, from Oklahoma State, like Dr. Traveler there, because Cliff and I, when we were going to school and studying Indian history, you either came out of OSU or Oklahoma. It was the only two schools really who produced people who wanted to do Native history. So, you had to come from, Oklahoma somehow, but having to attend one of those two schools. So Leonard was a cowboy. And so I teased him about that. And so he ran a program, he ran Indian Studies at University of South Dakota, and I ran a program at an Indigenous Studies program, a master's degree program at the University of Kansas. So sometimes the phone would ring and he'd say, hey, Don, and I'd say, how are you doing? And I would say, just fine, Leonard, how are you doing? And he said one time, says, Don, do you have a nickname? And do you have an Indian name? I said, well, Fixico is an Indian name. I said, but another Indian name, don't you have one? And I tell him, yeah, it's Miko. And Miko actually means king in the Muskogee language. So I got him to call me King Miko. And so I told him about that later on. He said, but I'll still call you Miko. So the phone would ring, he'd say, hey, Miko. And I'd say, yeah, hey, Buckskin Horse, how's it going? Because that was his Indian name. So we talked back and forth about a lot of things because both of us were running programs, and so we would vent to each other. One time we talked about being Indians, and I'll end here. And he said, being Indian is hard. And my reply to him was, I know, it's not right. Thank you. Mado.
John will be glad to answer questions. Anyone? Okay. No, I want you to take that one around.
Oh, I can take.
Or are you going to take it? Okay.
So certainly the point about prejudice and stereotypes is very clear. Is very clear because we've seen it in cartoons and all the images and the thing. But you made a comment. You don't have to look Indian to be Indian. And so at the base, what is it that's shared, that's positive? Is it some kind of language? Is it a certain kind of religious belief? What would you say then, what makes it Indian in a positive sense?
This is where the English language breaks down, because it's a way of feeling. You feel good. You feel like Superman or some Superwoman because things just don't affect you because it bounces off of you. And it's like if you and I were to go to a stomp dance or something like that and you come away from it. And, my tribes, the Creeks and the Muskogees and Seminoles, we celebrate green corn. It's just simply dancing around a fire. But it's so inviting and inclusive that you feel a part of it and you think, where did this come from? I feel like, and you've been invited because they say everybody dance. And you don't have to, but it's like being a part of it. And once you're a part of it, you just feel good in your heart. And I've been to many of these stomp dances before. I grew up that way, you know, that was my way of life. And it's like time stops during that time. Everything stops, and it's a good feeling. And that's what that is. It's optimism, it's called an optimal moment. And that can happen like on a birthday, holiday, or something like that. But to continue that optimal moment of being who you are. And in a way, it's not really being Indian, it's being who you are. Being who you are. And many of us, we fight against being who we are. And if you're Italian, you know, if you're Jewish, etc., then be proud of who you are and make those connections with your history and your people. One thing about Indians, they tell us, never forget who your people are. Always being connected. And a part of it, I guess, is being connected. And not just with human beings, with the earth, animals, plants, and everything. It's a different realization. I weaseled out of that, but that's what I'm saying tonight. Once I was talking to a group of people, and so it was a long, long time ago, and it was, I didn't realize it was kind of a church group, and I said something like, amen, amen. I said, amen, amen. so you have to be careful sometimes. Sure.
One thing that I'm sorry.
Mid-80s, or about the beginning of the 80s, like looking at the back of the Newsweek or on my break at work, saw a little article talking about the birth of a white buffalo in upstate New York. And it impressed me. I didn't know at that time anything about it and its impact. Today on OPA, it's a fair question to ask you. How has that white buffalo's birth impacted Native American or Indian scholarship or growth and whatsoever? Has it had sort of a ripple effect besides upstate New York?
Yes. There was also a white buffalo born in Janesville, Wisconsin. And I happened to be living in Wisconsin at the time. And these are albino buffaloes, you know, that are born, and sometimes they do happen. But when they do happen, they're such a rare event that Lakota people have back in their legends and stories and everything, that's a time for critical change is going to happen, hopefully for the good. And so that's when you see a lot of prayer ties, you know, where the buffalo is, because a lot of people come from miles and miles around to kind of recognize, you know, that place, because it's like a hallowed area where the buffalo was born. And so that means, and kind of a lesson to people, that, hey, we've got to wake up and not just help ourselves individually, but help each other and help ourselves to kind of get back on the right road of treating each other fairly and justly and things like that, and taking care of the earth. I mean, there's just one earth, right? And we've got to do a better job than what we're doing. And so sometimes these signals or these legend, you know, stories are sent to us as kind of messages. But someday I think these messages might be running out.
I find it fascinating, especially if people go to get their DNA researched, because recently I did that and I came out with 49% Native American. And I thought, wow, this is great. But it also shows that you have a little bit of ethnicity in a lot of other countries, you know, or a lot of other areas. And that's why I feel that we're all immigrants, you know, and we should be proud of being an immigrant, because we do come from various other places.
Oh, indeed. In fact, Native people were called first Americans, but we came here too, you know, over the Bering Strait. You know, it's like 60 miles wide and everything. Hopefully with a couple of islands in between, you know, then it wasn't so hard, but it was really hard thousands and thousands of years ago. Or maybe other explanation stories about, you know, coming to the Western Hemisphere. But indeed, this country is great for its diversity of people coming from all parts of the world. But I think what is important is to find out, more about yourself, where you do come from, your history and your heritage and things like that, because let me tell you, as you get older, then you'll start wanting to fill in the pieces. It was in 1980 that I started studying American Indian history, but I was in Indian studies since 1951. So learning to be more about yourself and being who you're connected to and how you're connected, if it doesn't help you, then write these stories down on the back of photographs. Write the names of individuals and when the photograph was taken, because if you don't ask those questions by curiosity, then your grandchildren will, your children will. So sometimes we need to do it for them because it's a part of reaffirming of who we are.
I have a question regarding reservations, the status of reservations today. It seems there's they have diminished. I noticed like in the Southwest, there are quite a few reservations, but further up north, I don't see hardly any. And the other question about that, the conflicts of laws within the reservation, when they're in a certain locality, conflict with their communities outside, if there's problems with that. It's a two-part question.
Yes, and the answer is kind of either way, because sometimes relations are difficult, and these are usually with border town, people in the border towns next to reservations and back and forth and so forth. You have that kind of situation, but you have other places, like in Arizona and also like in Oklahoma, where that the tribes are working with the community. The Cherokees of Oklahoma, for example, they provided COVID vaccines when the state of Oklahoma didn't have enough supplies. Imagine that. They stepped in. And the Muskogees did the same thing too. Not just helping their own people, but helping everyone. Because COVID has impacted everyone. And my wife and I, we know 71 people who've died from COVID. And so it's really kind of, taking care of each other because it's human to human. And so we need to realize that. So these relationships can be difficult, and so if they're difficult, there's room for improvement, and there's some positives going on at the same time. I mean, some tribes have bought in fire trucks and taken care of roads and built hospitals and things like that, not just for their own tribal people, but for everyone.
I was rather pleased and surprised when the slide came up of the Lakota woman, but I was also surprised, and maybe I passed this over when I read the book, about the fact that she was mixed blood and the effect on her. What I recall, though, was her defiance as a young girl, her anger, her unwillingness to be told, and she resisted tremendously. She was quite the woman. And I'm now thinking, was the trigger to her defiance actually the fact that she felt different because she was mixed blood?
And Ihosa, she was caught in between and trying to figure out what was going on. And that will happen to a lot of us. And we'll find kind of support, with other people who are in that kind of state of confusion. But she's fighting against that and fighting against the trauma and everything, and she just wanted to be accepted. I think all of us want to be accepted. To live by yourself is incredible. It's an incredible challenge. But so we are social people. We are social animals. And we are meant to live, among people. And maybe we were meant to live among diverse people at the same time. So maybe I better go back and read Alice in Wonderland.
Thank you for your presentation tonight. A previous questioner asked you, what is the essence of being an Indian? And I think I heard you say, it's worldview and the way you see yourself connected to everything else. My question is, among younger Native Americans, are there agnostics and atheists that don't share that worldview?
We have all types. We can fit any menu. I think the most difficult is when Native people don't want to be Native people. When the pressures from the outside, going back to Richard Pratt and everything, all of that is so powerful that you don't want to be who you are. And what that is self-rejection. It's like Mary Crow Dog. And that can have quite an effect when you don't want to be who you are. And many of us, throughout all of our lifetimes, we'll go through these identity crises. Well, and where do I come from and all of that? And we need to realize that's reinvention of identity. And that'll happen to you about 4 or 5 times in your lifetime. And just to recognize that we go through these transitions. I could talk about just theoretically about Homo Biaba and cultural hybridity in the third space, but in that third space, we become that new person. That's how our America was born, an American, that kind of identity.
My question is in regards to a follow-up in regards to the ancestry. When people find out they have a high percentage, I think it's kind of a reflection of the assimilation, where you've had your family history eradicated for the purpose of whatnot, for many different reasons, or when people felt that they had to hide their identity for fear of losing their property or persecution, the way that California has our own genocide, even though we don't want to admit it. For example, being Mexican, we're just told, you're mestizo, you're mixed, don't even bother looking into it. But as we search ourselves, it took me to go back 16 generations to confirm that the area where my family had been, that we are in fact Chichimeca. But those are some of the challenges. And so of course, there's no way that I can prove that descendants. But for the folks that are now realizing it and making those connections, are there tribal entities that are actively reaching out and say, welcome back, we'd like to enroll you, or how is that working? Because I know that there's the concern that is there are less and less people that are enrolled. The funding from the BIA or from the government will start to reduce because they're saying you don't have enough enrolled members to continue to exist.
Yes. I think, are we out of time? Should I wind things up?
You can respond to that if you want, and then we can, I think we have, do we have one more? But you can respond to this one, we'll take one more and.
Okay. I don't have a response, but I think that was more of a commentary. I learned more from what you were talking. I don't have an answer.
No, just is there any sort of outreach to
Yes.
try to find people to re-enroll?
I can speak Cherokee Nation, yes. Cherokee Nation has
The Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and the Katuah Cherokee Band of Oklahoma, they both do outreach events all over the country. If you can show descendancy, then they have outreach all over the country. They hold events where people can come in, they can learn about the tribe, they can learn about the process for going ahead and becoming a member on the tribal roll and what benefits you gain as an at-large citizen. Just about 3 weeks ago in the Phoenix area, the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma held an outreach event for at-large citizens, and they had over 250 people there. And so that shows you how Native people have been displaced from their ancestral communities over time, and so now the nations are reaching out. The other issue that's very thorny has been that of the history of slave ownership on the part of Native nations, especially in the southeastern US. And now we have Native nations that are beginning to wrestle with the legacy of having enslaved other human beings, and those individuals also intermarrying with the communities or having been part of the communities for so long. And so now we see court cases, but also we see some nations like the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma are going ahead and enrolling what they call the freedmen descendants, and they are putting them on the tribal rolls. Sorry, I'm Don's wife, and I study in particular Oklahoma Native people, so I am up with this.
I think we'd love to have you come back and give a lecture sometime too. We have a question in the back and then one more here, and then we'll wrap it up. So 2 questions, let's go.
Hauka, my name is Arlene Camarena. I am Kauia, Luisenyo Kumiai Paukuichum. I have a question. For those of us that might be new in regards to getting into academia and navigating through these white spaces, because they are still white spaces, predominantly white spaces, what advice can you give some of us in regards to the things that you use as a main motivator? Because it seems as if in some of these spaces, there not have been that much of a positive change especially when it comes to bringing in Indigenous people into teach history and things like that. So do you have any type of advice that you might be able to give some of us here that are Indian and that would like to hear it?
I said a little bit earlier something that my grandmother taught me, and it was hard work. I never realized how far hard work can take you. And I've always been a believer in hard work, and I've always thought that I will work harder than anyone in this room in whatever task is chosen, if I choose to do that task. And that takes a huge amount of resilience, and it's like climbing uphill, backwards and everything. But it's keep moving forward, keep going forward. And what I've realized, because I've witnessed tons of racism, the number of times I've been called, hey Indian or hey chief and all of that. I've got to tell you a quick story about my brother. He's a car salesman, he's gone now. And he would be called chief, and he turned around and looked at this person. This became his kind of common response. You're calling me a chief? Well, you look like hell. You look like you need a leader. So he would come right back at them. But what I've also found is that if you do something extremely well, very well, that can't be denied. No matter what it is, if it's in science, if it's in writing and literature, and if you do that extremely well, you'll be getting emails and phone calls and things like that. But you've got to do things extremely well. And so often, why is it in this country that people want to do the minimum, but to be paid the maximum for the minimum that they do, and they turn it in late? Why is that? If you turn things in early and do it as well as you can, then it's the exemplar piece of work, then people begin to recognize that. But we've got to do exemplar work, not as just as Native people, but all of us, to be the best that you can at whatever that you do. And that'll take you far. It will. Further than you'll realize.
Yeah, I just had a question on identifying as an Indian or Indigenous person. And if someone were to go back into their family tree and find one Indigenous person 6 generations ago within their family tree, but the rest were all non-Native or non-Indian, do you think it's fair for that person to identify as an Indian if, in fact, that might give them benefits? You talked about pretendian and it being an Indian for benefits. Because they could say, yes, 6 generations ago, I had a great-great-great-great-grandmother that was, in fact, Indigenous. But if they weren't raised in Indigenous culture and their life has been predominantly Caucasian person, is it fair for them to identify as Indigenous?
That's part of Indian identity where you get into the politics of it. But it's always like you mix history and politics, and what do you get? Politics. You mix art and politics, and what do you get? Politics.
But as a whole-blooded person, how do you feel about someone doing that?
I want to see the outcome, because if the person comes and participates and can learn my language better than I can learn it, and do better dances than I can, and all of that, and their heart is there. Because in their heart, it doesn't matter who you are, but if you have an Indian heart and whatever that is, I'm not even sure what that is, then I want to embrace that person, because that person can be a better Native person than a person who by blood is supposed to be Native, and they don't. And I've met a lot of Native people who are like that. They want the benefits to be Native, but they don't want to do anything for it. It's always like they show up, at a tribal office. How do I get enrolled? And that's it. But to pay the same price that we paid and everything, and to know the history. I mean, it's been a tough one. I mean, coming from Oklahoma, wow. And I study American history. It's got one of the darkest histories that you can imagine. And when you think it's bad, it's even worse than that. So, but it's reality. And so when I say I come from Oklahoma, yeah, and sometimes I'm glad that people don't know the full history of Oklahoma, but I do. But it's one you have to kind of just keep moving forward. I want to leave you with two things. Some kind of Muskogee philosophy, Muskogee Seminole philosophy I was brought up with. We problem solve among Muskogees by problem prevention. We see the problem that other people have, and we do things to prevent that problem from happening. Planning ahead. If you want to stay ahead, plan ahead. And if you do happen to have that problem and you tried to prevent it, find somebody who's been through that problem and what they did, and your answer might be there and how to solve that. But to recognize the problems that are coming ahead. That relates to the next thing I want to leave with you. We have a phrase called Isaganamizi no Kichka. Isaganamizi is a maker of breath. As you breathe in right now, the word you speak, that's Isaganamizi, that power, that breath. Comes in, animals, human beings, all of us. Isaganamizi. No Kichka means to look up at the sky, at the breath maker. Why? A long time ago, especially in Oklahoma, Indian Territory is what it was. You'd travel a road, and most of the time it was a dirt road. In Oklahoma, you're watching for storms, keeping your head up. And so as you keep your head up on the horizon, you could anticipate the storms coming in and be prepared for that, and always. We also have a way of speaking to tornadoes, to twisters, among the Muskogees. And so it's knowing what is ahead of you. Isaganamizi no Kichka is maybe a good philosophy in life. As you travel, look at the horizons. Look what's ahead of you and to plan ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.